Yeah, we can start anytime.
Yeah. Uh, so we are starting now. विद्या भारती उच्च शिक्षा संस्थान द्वारा आयोजित राष्ट्रीय शिक्षा नीति 2020 से संबंधित इंटरव्यू सीरीज में आप सभी का स्वागत है. We are thankful to Manniya Raghunandan ji for initiating dialogue and discussion on various aspects of NEP. Today we are going to discuss the probable effects of NEP 2020 on scientific research. इस कड़ी में आज हमारे साथ मौजूद हैं डॉक्टर शेखर मांडे. He is Secretary DSIR and Director General Council of Scientific and Industrial Research. Dr. Mande is a structural and computational biologist. He did his MSc in physics from University of Nagpur. He holds Doctor of Philosophy and Molecular Biophysics from Indian Institute of Science. You are welcome, sir. The interview will be moderated by Dr. Manjushree Deshpande and Dr. Srivalsa Kolthiar. Manjushree Sardesh Pandey is head of the Department of English at R.S. Munde Dharampeeth Arts and Commerce College, and Dr. Srivalsa Kolthiar is assistant professor at NIT, Surathkal, Karnataka. You are welcome, ma'am, and you are welcome, Srivalsa ji. Now I request Manjushree Deshpande ji to introduce the subject. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Anish ji, and a warm welcome to Shekhar Mande sir. And first of all, I feel what you say, very happy to have this interaction with you, as I also belong to Nagpur. So it's a special honor and privilege for me to have this interaction with you. And the first question which I would like to ask you is, actually, as far as NEP is concerned, this NEP, in this NEP, research plays a very important role. And right from right from the school education, or we are talking about having teaching universities, which will also have some research in the teaching universities. And again, we are going to have some separate research universities also. So when we are going to talk about so much of research, are we prepared? And how are we going to deal with this research at the undergraduate level? Or when we are talking about having this scientific aptitude, developing this scientific aptitude in the students, then how do we look at it at the school level? And how do we look at it at the undergraduation level? And after that, how we look at it at the post-graduation level? Because right now research is like it is most of the laboratories only conduct this research, like CSIR and DAE and all these, they conduct research. And as far as colleges and institutes and universities are concerned, not much research is happening in this area. So how do we begin? Because now research is the main focus in this NEP. So how do you visualize this?
Yeah, thank you, Manjushri, for the question. What I will first say is that the education system that we have evolved in the past few decades is the one in which we expect teachers to come to the classroom and refer to standard textbooks and then teach the students, give the knowledge to the students. And although questioning from students and all is encouraged in many places it's not encouraged, depending upon the personalities of teachers and all. But nonetheless, it's one kind of a one-way communication from the teacher to the student. Now, a lot of people believe that this is not the correct way of educating the next generation. What people would like to believe is that we must learn from evidences around us. Whatever we actually learn from what we see around us is the best form of teaching. In fact, Swami Vivekananda actually had propagated that more than 100 years ago, saying that the teaching or learning must be from the evidence, what you see around you, right? And that's the crux this policy actually tries to address. When it says research essentially actually tells you that you have to do something on your own so that you gain knowledge out of it. Now, the role of teachers is supreme in such a thing that the teachers then actually don't tell students from the textbooks that this is so, and that's why you trust me that this is so, and therefore I'm telling you. That's not the question. The teacher gently guides the student and then asks the students to perform either experiment or a thought experiment or whatever, and think about the phenomena around us. I mean, just to give you a simple example, if you are teaching, let us say, a physics experiment about optics, and then there are lenses, if you say, and then you're teaching a concept of a focal length of a lens. When you take a focal length, the best experiment that could be done is actually take a lens in your hand. Lenses are not very expensive. And we take a lens in your hand and actually try to focus and then teach the concept of what is the focal point, or go out in the sun and then put it on a piece of paper, that particular focal point, and things like that. There's probably much better way of learning. Then the students actually are trying to gather evidence on their own and doing that. In a larger sense, research actually means that the gathering of evidence by a person is actually what the research would qualify in that particular sense in the context of education. Research is not always that you have to go out and find something new or discover something new. That, of course, is the objective of research when you go to higher and higher level. And beyond a particular point, of course, you want to actually advance the level frontiers of knowledge. That research is different than the research what we talk about here is the evidence-based learning. And that's a very integral component of the education policy that has been proposed. And I think that has been a long sought dream by many people around, that this is probably the most effective way of doing that. And in the Indian traditional education system, always emphasis has been put on this, that there has to be evidence-based learning. And that's what essentially research means. Now, for doing this kind of research, the second question that you ask about the colleges and universities and all, is not necessary that every time you need very sophisticated equipments and things like that. Experiments can also be set up by much less sophisticated things around us. I mean, you can also find a lot of waste things around us, and based on that, you can actually set up some very good, interesting experiments. And I don't know whether you have had chance of looking at Arvind Gupta toys. He created toys, he used to create toys out of this waste, and there's some fantastic. And if you play with those toys, automatically you are teaching certain principles. What is the principle that is behind that? And that's the way it could be actually taught. And that's the philosophy of the education policy. So it doesn't require really a very heavy infrastructure, as might be perceived wrongly by certain people, that without infrastructure, how are you going to implement research? And without research, how are you going to teach? Now, for doing this, our challenge is going to be, how do we implement this thinking across all the people, right? All the stakeholders, parents, students, teachers, all of them have to actually align with this particular idea. Typically, our society has evolved so that the parents would only look at how much percentage his ward has obtained, I mean, with a 95%, and say that 96% is better than 95, or 97 is better than 96, or 98 is better than 97. Now, that is a paradigm that what we have evolved in the last few decades is probably not the correct paradigm. More than the percentage of mark a student obtains in an examination, whether the student has been imparted the correct knowledge, and the correct knowledge has come from direct evidence-based learning, is much more important. We'll create much better citizens for future if we actually adopt that kind of learning system, rather than a textbook learning system in which we evaluate the students in trying to reproduce the knowledge that they have learned in 1 year in about 1 or 2 or 3 hours of an examination, and ranking them whether 98.9% and 98.97%, the difference between the two students. That's not correct. So there's the philosophy of the new education policy, and I think it's very welcome.
Thank you, sir.
Namaskar, sir. I am Srivalsa. I am an alumnus of IAAC, Bangalore. And I also had the opportunity to chair the Students' Council at IAAC. So we had a lot of questions when I was a student, and now I am a faculty, so some new questions are there. So I have some such questions in my mind, which I will be asking to you. So it is an honor for us to have you with us today. Sir, in India, so through NEP, what is our focus? Are we going to focus on basic science research, or are we going to give more focus on the translational research, which will have an impact on the society, providing technical solutions to issues of societal concern? So what should be the way forward for India?
Thank you, Sival sir. It's good to know that I have connection with both you and Manjushri. And I'm sure Manjushri's maiden name, if I know, we will find a common connection. In Nagpur, everyone knows everyone. And Shrimati Sival sir, I also used to be a student leader in IISc. And as a student leader, we actually did a lot of good things. I don't know whether you know that students used to stop getting fellowship at the end of 5 years. And I was the one who led arguments in the IISc committee of professors and all, and made sure that students get fellowship even on 5 years. So that was when I was the leader and students leader. I have fond memories of both as well as IISc. Now, in terms of research, see, generally, this is a common thing that for common people, that whether research is fundamental research or whether the research which benefits society in the end. And that concept is for common people. For people like us here on this particular platform, we know that there is no such distinction really. You know, I mean, anytime you are advancing the frontier of knowledge, at some other point, it is bound to find some good solution for the society. You know, I don't think Einstein, when he was deriving the general theory of relativity, he would have actually thought of that how much useful it is going to be in modern day. There are so many modern day technologies that have used Einstein's relativistic formalism in trying to actually generate technologies, and many of those technologies have immensely benefited the mankind. I don't think Ramanujan, when he was working on number theory, would probably have known that today's bank transactions or credit card transactions, they're all based on certain cryptic numbers or cryptic passwords and all, and they all have their origins in the number theory that Ramanujan was working on. So eventually, any good work that is done, any good research finding would find a use for society. Now, having said that, we should also recognize that many of us actually would like to see the fruits of research reach the society. You know, when all of us very fondly think that one day during my lifetime, whatever work I may have done has actually reached the society. And that gives one immense pride that this thing I have done in my own lab, and I have seen so many people in the society benefit by that. You know, I mean, that would be the thing to do. So the education policy doesn't really actually distinguish between these two concepts. Education policy only essentially drives at the fact that it's evidence-based learning. It's kind of research that students can undertake on their own. Think of experiments. Even if they're reinventing wheels, fine, but they're reinventing wheels on their own. You know, but then if you do something on your own, that concept will be ingrained in your mind forever. And that's a beautiful aspect of this particular policy.
Thank you, sir. That is very enlightening answer. Thank you, sir.
Sir, actually, how can we plan to rope in talented people to take up research as a career option? Because we see that nowadays very few children opt for research or want to go into research. So, and there is only 3% of science coverage by mass media also. There is no promotion of science as such, research as such. So what can we do to promote science and help or persuade children to take up this science career as a career option?
You know, I mean, when the children are choosing their careers, the hard reality of the times is such that they are influenced quite a lot by their parents, by their peers, and by their teachers. You know, now parents and friends, the way they influence the choice of a career of a kid is largely based on what actually is the means of living and sustenance for in the life of the future life of this particular child. And that's how the parents and peers would look at. But teachers typically in schools and colleges have a much larger role to play. And very often, when we look back upon our time when we were students, we always remember that one teacher who had inspired us to take up our profession. You know, all of us can name some teachers in our school and college who had enormous influence on us that we actually chose to be scientists, researchers or teachers or whatever, and would come from. So I would guess that teachers in schools and colleges and universities will have a very large role to play in shaping the career of a student, of a child. And if teachers are oriented that way, many more students, talented students, would take up research as a attractive career for future. The fundamental difference between research as a career and many other jobs as career is that most people who do research, scientific research, our motivation comes from the fact that we are trying to discover something new. We are trying to actually advance the frontiers of knowledge. And someday, what we discover in our own labs or some ideas that come directly out of our own mind will be taught to the future generations. Now, that's our motivation. For most scientists around the world, that is the motivation. For most scientists around the world, is not a motivation that how much power do I wield? How many people follow me on Twitter? How much money do I make? I don't think a large body of scientists would care about that. Most of the scientists would not care that I don't have more than 10 followers on Twitter. So be it, fine. But I'm generating new ideas in my lab. Or I don't make tons of money like many of the businessmen or other people make. I don't care. I mean, who cares about which scientist cares about money? Right? I mean, large body of scientists really don't bother how much money they are getting. And of course, money we should get, but nonetheless, that's not the primary motivation for scientists. How much power do I have? Do I head an organization with 10,000, 20,000, 40,000? Would care whether they are getting some very creative ideas and whether those creative ideas sooner or later going to be part of tomorrow's textbooks, and whether the scientists actually are discovering something which satisfies their own motivation. And that's exactly what it is for. And especially by teachers, and therefore I'm saying again and again, the teachers will have a very central role to play if this NEP 2020 is going to be successful for future. So teachers will actually have a very important role to play in this particular process.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. It was very convincing answer that the most rewarding experience for a scientist is doing the creative work itself. But still, as a normal human being, everybody will be worried about their future. So India is producing many PhDs, but many are facing problem in getting a job after that, especially for a livelihood. So considering our population size, so maybe we need well-funded institutions in thousands in numbers to enhance our quality and quantity of the doctorates produced. So do we have any data of PhD holders and their current employment status or any future plan to make a way for a livelihood also for all the PhD holders? Any plan in mind, sir?
Okay. See, what has happened is that we are very good in creating stereotypes in our society, right? So when you would recall when you were 10th or 11th or 12th, our peers and our teachers and our parents told us that you would get a very good job if you're an engineer or a doctor. I mean, that's the stereotype that we created. Same way, we create a stereotype that if you are doing a PhD, you are going to be an academic in your life. You are going to be a professor somewhere. Now, these stereotypes actually have been good, but only to a partial extent. Because we have to actually come out of this particular thinking that PhD necessarily means an academic or a professorial job. Like there are a large number of other things that a PhD can also do. What is actually becoming clear is that people who have entrepreneurial ambitions, for example, having done PhD and using that particular technology, if you can actually translate a technology for the benefit of the society, and in the process, you actually form a very good entrepreneurship. I mean, there are many different examples around the world who have very successfully translated their own knowledge for the larger benefit of society by means of starting their own entrepreneurship ventures. That's a new culture that is coming up. There's, for example, what we call a startup India and things like that, right? I mean, there's a kind of new culture that is coming up. Similarly, students after doing PhD can also be outstanding teachers. I mean, if a student wants to go after PhD into a school, primary school, to be a teacher, I mean, that also is an attractive option. But somehow, while doing PhD, the stereotype that we have created, we have already shut that option out. You know, when after a PhD, you can't go to primary school and teach. You know, I mean, that's a stereotype, but then nothing stops. But nonetheless, that's an option that is available, and people should seriously consider that people must do, or the students must do what really their heart tells them what they should do. In my case, I would be good as an entrepreneur. I must become an entrepreneur, irrespective of I have obtained PhD or not. Similarly, I mean, we also need to communicate science very well to the outside world. The science that we do in the lab, on today's date, we have an enormous lack of people, we have an enormous dearth of people who can effectively communicate what happens in the four walls of a laboratory to the outside world. We don't have very many good, effective communicators who can do that. And we actually need those kind of people badly. That's another attractive option for students to do. And that option, for example, can only be exercised, not only be, but it's preferably be exercised after obtaining a PhD. If I obtain PhD in a very deep area of science, and then by then actually I have developed a broad overview either of my own area or my own subject or larger science, and if I'm a good communicator, if I can speak well, I can write well, I can make good movies, I can draw good cartoons, these are all very effective ways of communicating that to the larger public. So that option also should be available. So once again, doing PhD is not a stereotype to become professor, but other options are available. There's a lack of people in the country who understand both science and law. You know, I mean, especially intellectual property law, there are not too many people who understand. There are only a handful of people around the country who understand nuances of both, you know, and as world is becoming more competitive in protecting ideas, especially by intellectual property protection, we actually are going to need many more people in that particular area as well. There's a dearth of people who understand science and are effective administrators. You know, I mean, science administration is another very good aspect. People who can manage grants by grant giving agencies, people who can actually manage the corporate social responsibility funds for scientific institutions. So there is actually a dearth of people in many of those areas. So all these options are available for students to pursue once they have done PhD, and we must break the shackles of the stereotypes that we have created in the past, and we must actually place all these options before a person, and a person can ask a question to himself or herself, what is it that to my liking, right? And if I really love doing this, then I must do that. I should not get into the stereotypes that I should must get a job as a professor somewhere else. So that's my answer.
Very true, sir. Thank you.
Manjushri, mute it.
You have to unmute, please.
Sir, actually, we are producing so many PhDs, but how can we ensure useful and ethical research?
Yeah, so ethics is something that has to be taught to everyone, not at PhD level alone, but at all levels, right? I mean, uh, in Indian tradition, we have always been taught in our families कि दूसरों को चीज को हाथ नहीं लगाना है, right? I mean, unless it's something that belongs to you rightfully, you don't touch that thing, you don't steal things. I mean, this is actually taught in our families, right? All of us, when you grow up, we have been taught that, and that's a very glorious Indian tradition. That's part of ethics. Similarly, if by the time you come to science, there's a much larger ethics that you have to follow. You know, I mean, whose information you are using for what purpose, whether information rightly belongs to you or belongs to someone else, that particular information. If you are using, for example, conducting experiments on humans on certain things, have you taken the prior consent of that other human being that you're conducting experiment on that person? Does that person fully understand that you are performing experiment on that particular person? And what are the pros and cons of performing that experiment on the person? These are the part of ethics. You know, when we are publishing our result, whether the idea truly belongs to me or not, or the idea belongs to someone else, whether truly all the work that I have done, I am crediting that to the correct people when I'm publishing the work. These are all part of ethics, and these all probably should be taught at different levels. As I said, all the way from primary school level to PhD level, ethics must be an integral part of our learning process.
Actually, people don't know how to form the research questions, and therefore, they have a problem, and therefore they tend to, I think, copy paste and go ahead with unethical things.
Yeah, but that needs to be taught. I mean, in all the universities across the country, we must have a course on teaching proper ethics to the students. I mean, that must be ingrained in our mind that something that does not belong to us, including credit or authorship or whatever, we must not claim credit on that. So,
Thank you, sir. Sir, I have a question on the publication industry. So, because these days the commercial approach followed by the publishing house is an issue of concern for researchers globally, because the content of the paper is generated by researchers after 1 or 2 years of research, and the copyright is transferred to the journal for free. The review process is also done by scientists for free of charge. But to assess a journal content, we are supposed to pay high charge, or for an open access publication, the fee is sometimes equivalent to 1 year salary of a junior scientist. So can India do something to regulate the publishers from overcharging? What is your opinion, sir?
so that's a very interesting question. So what has happened in recent past is that since for last about 50, 60, 70 years, we have seen emergence of commercial publishing. In earlier days, publishing was a part of scientific societies. So learned scientific societies, they used to have presentation by people. People used to come and present their ideas before the learned scientific society, and those ideas would either get accepted or rejected. And if accepted, they would be eventually published in print in some form or other. But last 50, 60, 70 years actually started commercial publishing. In fact, Nature, like more than about 100 years that Nature has been now commercial publishing results for people around the world. Now, what is more recent is the online publishing phenomenon. The surge in the internet use has seen people also publishing online, and the body of work that is being published has also exponentially gone up in the last 10, 20 years. That has led to many online publishers coming online and making the research available to the larger readership. Many of them charge money. In fact, most of them actually charge money for publishing, and what is called as the author pay model, in which the author pays for publishing, but the reader does not pay anything. So many journals which have actually come up, in which the readers have a free access to the published research, but the authors pay for them. Okay, that's one. The second thing that has come about is that the reader pays. So the print journals of the classical print journals in which the author did not pay, and the reader, actually libraries subscribe to those journals, and the libraries pay a sufficiently heavy amount to the publisher. There's a second model. And then there are, of course, the hybrid models. Author also pays and the reader also pays. All these have achieved. Now, to me, it appears that author pay model should be such that the overall scientific readership benefits by the research that is being published. But commercially, it being so attractive that many online publishers actually charge very heftily, as you said correctly, at times so much so that, equivalent to salary of a person to the authors. And I don't think that's healthy. In my personal opinion, I'm not expressing opinion of any government or my organization. I am expressing my personal opinion that in my opinion, I don't think that's healthy. And we should try to see that we break away from that particular model. And at CSIR, we are trying to see whether CSIR as an organization can promote some quality research publishing and without heftily charging the authors. We have just begun that process, and I hope that we'll be successful in the long term, that we don't charge authors very hefty money. At the same time, we make research accessible to all the readership, right? And through the common, very rigorous process of peer review. The peer review is a very standard accepted process, which is the backbone of research publishing. And without compromising the peer review system, whether we can make research accessible to many readers and not charging authors that heftily. So we don't create business out of it, but rather we do it as a service to the scientific fraternity. That should be the correct model.
Thank you, sir. Sir, in continuation to this question, because we have the term international journals, national journals, etc. appear, especially in the faculty appraisal forms of the Indian institutes. So science being universal, so is it right to call international journal, national journals, etc.? And again, to add, we see that most of the journals published by, say, some of the American societies or other international societies. So even we also wish to publish in those journals, and we give least preference to Indian journals. So can something be done in this regard, or any model that Indian agencies or societies can come up with to promote Indian journals where foreign journal scientists also will publish?
Yeah, I think that's a very desirable thing to do. I don't think it's healthy to classify national and international journals. Everything is for world to know, right? I mean, what you publish is there for everybody to read, and therefore there is nothing national or international about it. Now, many Indian journals actually started with this idea that we have to make our work available to the readership across the world. And many of the journals in the early years have done exceptionally well. You know, I mean, I can give you 2 or 3 examples. For example, a journal of the Indian Academy of Sciences called Pramana, that many physicists they actually they regard Pramana as a good journal, and people including Sir C.V. Raman have published in Pramana. You know, I mean, that's a very good journal for physicists. Similarly, for statisticians, there is a journal called Sankhya. It also is supposed to be a good journal. For the biologists, there is a journal called Journal of Genetics that also Indian Academy of Sciences publishes. That's also a good journal. So basically, the journal quality depends upon how the peer review process has been, whether the journal has followed the correct route in acceptance or rejection of ideas, and how widely circulated the journal is and the readership is. Now, one unfortunate part that has happened in the last 30, 40 years is that everybody's promotions or recognition or getting grants, all that has actually been based on where you have published your work. Now, that's an unfortunate part. Now, all of us take a larger philosophical view that it is not important where you publish your work, but what you have published. So the content of your research is way more important than where it appears, which journal it appears, you know, and that must be ingrained in our system. That must be ingrained in our evaluation system for promotions, recruitment, for award and recognition, and so on and so forth. And until we do that, I don't think we'll be able to break the shackles of this publishing in a very high-fi journal or something. Now, let me also tell you that there are a large number of very distinguished people have published papers in what appear to be not so high-fi journals, you know, and yet they have obtained recognition of that, including Nobel Prizes and all. Some of the journals that they have published have not been that well accepted, but yet they eventually went on to obtain Nobel Prize in that way. And we should ingrain that feeling across the entire community that it is not where you publish, but it's what you publish is important.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. So how can we foster collaborations between the government, academicians, and industry, facilitating the flow of innovations from research centers of universities to the industry?
That's a fantastic question, Manjushri. I'm glad that you asked it. What happens is that in terms of the translational research, that is the research that we do in the lab, and we would like to see its benefit going to either entrepreneurship or to society at large. It is imperative that academia and industry must come closer together. You know, the typical model that what we have had in India has been that we do research in our lab, disregarding the fact that what society needs. I mean, I'm not saying in a negative sense. I am saying it that we actually do work, but we have not actually given due consideration that this is the need of the society, and that's why I'm working on this particular problem. All right. So the gap analysis has not been done. Number two, we do work in the lab disregarding the fact that industry, when it wants particular thing to be done, industry looks at many different aspects. Industry looks at whether this technology is competitive or not, whether implementing this technology is going to be commercially viable or not, whether this technology is going to be scalable or not, whether it can be actually scaled at a large level, which kind of considerations typically academicians may or may not miss, you know. So there is a subtle gap between the academicians in laboratories and universities and industry in their perspective of what kind of work actually would eventually translate for the benefit of society. Now, typically in the parlance, we call it technology readiness level or TRL. You know, the TRL 1 to 3 is typically what happens in the labs, and TRL 8 and 9 when the technologies are implemented in the field. You know, so and there is a gap in between TRL 1 to 3 and TRL 8 9. There is a gap, and of late, this gap is increasingly being filled by startups and entrepreneurs and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, we have to have structured mechanisms in which industries, startups, MSMEs, and academia work together. You know, I mean, ultimate benefit of the society is only when we all come together and work for a common cause of the betterment of the society. So we must have the structured mechanism by which academicians, like professors or scientists in labs, and startups, the people who are actually starting entrepreneurship out of the technologies that are being generated in the lab, to MSMEs. The MSMEs don't have that great deal of resources to conduct research on their own, but can rely upon the academicians to provide research feedback to them, or larger industries. All of us come together and work together. Now, typically in the international parlance, it is called as the triple helix model. That is, the academicians, government, and industry, they come together and generate such kind of models in different places. And we are right now attempting to create those. In the department that I lead, the Department of Scientific and Industrial Research, the triple helix model, we are trying to generate concepts of this, and we are approaching industries whether they would be interested in partnering, and we are approaching academia, universities and all, whether they would be interested in partnering. And hopefully in the next year or two, we'll be able to implement such structured mechanisms for bringing academia and industry together. As far as CSR is concerned, in CSR also we have been trying to interact with industry very closely to see whether industry can come and work with our labs so that we can actually work together on commonly identified problems of the society. So these are the kind of things actually that we are trying to do right.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. So it is a welcome idea always to go hand for academia and industry to go hand in hand. So from the CSIR website, when I was going through, I understand that the patent filing and licensing by CSIR is more than the global average, which is a very good thing to note. So, sir, will NEP create an ecosystem for scientists and faculty members to form and run their own companies using their innovative ideas? Is that possibility open, will be open?
So NEP doesn't directly mention this, the point that you are mentioning, but there is another very important document that is under preparation right now, is the Science, Technology and Innovation Policy 2020, STI, that Professor Ashutosh Sharma and Professor Vijayaraghavan are steering it at this moment to create that. And that very specifically addresses these kind of issues. And once the STIP 2020 is ready, that will try to address this particular issue of startup ventures, of entrepreneurship, and so on and so forth. My own department, DSIR, had in 2009 formulated a small policy by which we could promote entrepreneurship in academic places. You know, there is a very famous May 2009 OM that DSIR had taken out, and that actually defines the path in which academicians like scientists or professors or lecturers, through their own research that they have done in the lab, they can float a separate entrepreneurship venture. So, but NEP doesn't have a direct this thing to into this, but STIP will do that.
Thank you, sir. And earlier, as you said, that CSIR is complementing, like NEP is also focusing on fostering R&D in Bharati universities. So how CSIR can complement these efforts? You've already talked about some of the things which you are doing, but how can CSIR complement these efforts?
So once again, at this moment, we are actually in the midst of what is called as a restructuring of CSIR. There's one committee, a very high-level committee set up by the Honorable Prime Minister, had given its report on restructuring. And one aspect of restructuring is that how do we bridge the gap between academia and industry? And the model that we are considering there is to have CSIR supported labs on academic campuses such as IITs, NITs, universities, central universities, and all. And the idea of the centers would be to bring industry and academia together. So the students of the universities, the faculty of the universities, and the industries in a targeted way to bring them closer. But apart from this, CSIR also has its own academy. CSIR has promoted an academy called ACSIR, and ACSIR also has large number of students who are doing PhD with it. And through them also, we are trying to see whether these kind of ideas can be promoted for entrepreneurship and starting entrepreneurship and so on and so forth.
Yes, and CSIR has demonstrated its commitment for protecting Bharatiya knowledge also, as was the case of Haldi. So are there any continual efforts in this matter?
Yes. So Haldi is a very good example that you gave, that when CSIR realized several years ago, 20 years ago, that somebody was claiming intellectual property on Haldi, CSIR immediately came into being, and CSIR actually filed a suit and eventually won that particular legal battle. Now, having won that particular legal battle, CSIR realized that it's utmost important that we protect our traditional knowledge. And at that stage, CSIR actually initiated documentation of our traditional knowledge in a digital form. As you know, one of the important aspects of patenting or protecting intellectual property is prior knowledge. If some prior knowledge exists in a particular area, you cannot claim intellectual property on that area or a particular subject. Something like that. And to keeping that in mind, what CSIR did, CSIR had initiated something called a Traditional Knowledge Digital Library, or TKDL. And a TKDL is actually now chronicling all the traditional knowledge that exists in India. We started with our focus on medicinal knowledge, and especially plant extracts and so on and so forth. And we contacted large number of Ayurvedic physicians, Unani physicians, practitioners of Sowa Rigpa, yoga, and so on and so forth. And that knowledge is now being chronicled very systematically. On today's date, we have about 3.5 lakh entries in TKDL. So different plant extracts and what are the remedial properties of those, against which kind of disorders, all of that is being chronicled in this TKDL. And it's an ongoing activity. Very soon, we are going to expand this ongoing activity into other areas of traditional knowledge, such as metallurgy, architecture, and so on and so forth. So our dream in the coming 5 or 10 years is that much of the traditional knowledge that has existed for centuries in India would be available in a digital format somewhere. Probably you're not aware of this, but in the 1950s, when India became independent, it was very imperative that we catalog our knowledge somewhere. And a very famous document called Wealth of Nation was created at that particular time. And once again, CSIR had taken the principal role of leading that particular thing. The Wealth of the Nation, there is a multiple volumes of that is available. What is the mineral wealth of India? What is the plant wealth of India? And so on and so forth. The TKDL, that exercise which is going on right now, essentially aims towards that what traditional knowledge has existed in India, and whether we can actually keep a record of that in digital form, so that for perpetuity, nobody will be able to claim any intellectual property based on what has been practiced in India for several centuries. That's the idea of that particular one.
Thank you, sir.
It is excellent effort to document the traditional knowledge system available in India. So we hope it will create wonders in future, complementing the modern science and technology. In the same line, how the science and technology and research that is happening in our premier institutions and scientific laboratories fulfill the dream of Gandhiji's village Swaraj and also the idea of Atmanirbhar Bharat.
Yeah, so a lot of people are actually now getting aware of Atmanirbharta, and thanks also to the clarion call given by Honorable Prime Minister that we must actually have certain things that can be sustained within India and in the local ecosystem everywhere, all across the nation. And the best example I can think of is the COVID times. Before the COVID came, almost all the PPEs, all the RT-PCR kits and all used to be imported into the country. The personal protection gear used to be imported in the country. But in the COVID period, the good thing that has happened is that we now have several hundred manufacturers in the country, and we have become totally Atmanirbhar on that. There's some kind of a very remarkable thing that has happened is that during COVID period, all Indians have risen to the occasion, whether be it academia, industry, MSMEs, everyone together, and have worked together towards this particular concept of Atmanirbharta. Now, having said that, the rural aspect also is a very interesting, important aspect to address. And people are working at it. Especially, for example, many of the agricultural the benefits that happen in the labs of ICAR, those benefits are transferred to the farmers through what they have a chain of what they call as Krishi Vigyan Kendras. There are more than 700 Krishi Vigyan Kendras across the country. And that's a very, very welcome thing that what ICAR has done. It's a remarkable thing that ICAR has done. And something similar must also happen across different sectors so that people can support themselves in rural areas and they can self-sustain themselves in their own neighborhood, in their own geographical niche where they stay, so that not everyone needs to look at cities to migrate to for sustaining themselves. And that would be a dream come true if it happens in the coming 10 or 20 years.
Yes, sir.
Yes. And sir, research also requires cross-border collaborations also. But there are constraints put up by the government. So in this NEP, how do you think the scenario will change?
No, so research in the end, when you are advancing frontiers of knowledge is what I've been talking about. The knowledge is universal there, right? I mean, knowledge is not restricted to one community or particular group or a particular nation. Knowledge is world of knowledge is universal. And what we are trying to advance is the universal knowledge. And therefore, we must actually communicate constantly with our fellow practitioners of science around the world while we are working. So we do notice, and we don't actually also stop ourselves from learning from our peers abroad. So that actually that boundaries must be broken there to be able to exchange ideas with people around the world. And you are aware that many of the things that have been either discovered or invented here have gone unnoticed in the other parts of the world primarily because there was no communication between people here and other things. And therefore, it's important that we establish communication and maintain that communication with the world, what is happening in India. In that sense, whole world is one as far as knowledge is concerned. And therefore, it is important that we must continue to engage with the world with everything that what we are doing, so that the world learns from us, we learn from the rest of the world, both ways.
Sir?
Definitely.
Sir, the spending on research in India is less than 1% of GDP, whereas US, Israel, China, etc. spend 3 to 4%. So better facilities and more freedom are needed for doing great work in research. So how this will be addressed through implementation of NEP, especially the investment in research in future?
Yes. So what you're saying is right, that currently our investment into R&D is of the order of about 0.7% of our GDP. And many of us have been saying, and in fact, successively political leadership also has been saying that we must attempt to increase it to at least 2%. So that's our objective, is that to keep convincing the government to invest more and more money into R&D. Now, having said that, around the world, nations which spend so much money on research and development, substantial contribution comes also from the private sector. It's not all public money that goes into it. So when you say China or South Korea or Israel spend 3 or 4% of their GDP onto research and development, a substantial amount of that, as much as 50 to 60%, is contributed by the private sector. And it's therefore imperative that in India too, we involve private sectors into our research and development. The more and more the private sector starts investing money into research and development, it probably is better for the larger aspects of the society. So our objective would be to convince private industry to increase their contribution in research and development.
Thank you.
Okay. So the nature of research is going to change from monolithic to multidisciplinary. And in that context, how will CSIR adapt to it? as it is known to promote research in the specialized field of scientific and industrial research only.
Yeah, very right said, Madhushri, that indeed the boundaries are being broken between different disciplines. If you asked about 50, 60 years ago, when the social sciences and natural sciences were departing from each other, at that time, many of the natural science people probably would not have read Shakespeare. About 60 years ago, or even today, if you ask many of our physics and chemistry or biology professors, have you read complete Shakespeare? Probably answer would be no. At the same time, many of the people who are doing their MA literature or MCOM or something, you ask them, do you know the second law of thermodynamics? They would not be aware what the second law of thermodynamics. And this is actually written very well in the 1962 essay by a person called C.P. Snow. He said a tale of two cultures in which how different disciplines are diverging from each other. Now, since 1962, we have diverged even much further beyond that. And today the physics people find it difficult to understand the language of biology people, who find it difficult to understand the language of the mathematics people. And so we are actually diverging away. But increasingly around the world, people do think that we have to actually marry different disciplines together so that what eventually benefits is the knowledge of the world. And CSR, being a multidisciplinary organization itself, promotes that continuously. And some good examples have come up in recent times that how we actually combine knowledge from different disciplines to make equipment which are very important. For example, during COVID time, when the ventilators had to be made, our best ventilators were made by National Aerospace Laboratory. The National Aerospace Laboratory actually makes aeroplanes. They don't make ventilators. Ventilators are made by biomedical instrumentation companies. But National Aerospace Laboratory brought in their expertise into handling of wind and all, and they actually made a very beautiful ventilator, which is now being sold in the market. So I mean that kind of thing, if you try to bring interdisciplinarity so that people can come together and address common issues faced by humanity.
Yes.
Thank you.
Very true, sir.
Sir, how does NEP help retain the good academicians and good scientists in Indian institutions, like through fair faculty selection process, fast track promotion for scientists and faculty members, producing excellent research outcomes, etc., as mentioned in NEP? So when and how this is going to be implemented?
Yeah, so I will not be able to tell you when and how to be implemented. All I can comment about is NEP. Actually, those recommendations are far reaching. What it says is really very good, is that our recruitment and assessment processes must be sufficiently flexible in academics. I mean, we have to be very, very flexible. We can't go by rigid rules. I mean, when we were looking for jobs, when I was myself looking for a job, we were told that if you don't have a degree in chemistry, you cannot get a job in a chemistry department. And why? I mean, I don't understand why. I may have a PhD in molecular biophysics, but if I want to be a professor of, let us say, chemistry somewhere, I have sufficient grasp of chemistry to teach in a chemistry department, and I don't see any reason why I should not be able to do that. And if you look at the international recognition, the irony is that the recognition, when it comes from the most unexpected quarters. And let me give you a very good example. So the example is of Venki Ramakrishnan that all of us have heard of, the Nobel laureate. Now, Venki Ramakrishnan did his PhD in physics. He solved an outstanding problem of biology, of the structures of ribosomes and all, how the proteins are synthesized, and he got Nobel Prize in chemistry. Now, if Venki could be a physics degree holder, solving a problem of biology and get Nobel Prize in chemistry, I don't see any reason why our institutes are insisting that you have to have a primary degree in a particular discipline. I mean, that's, I think, I will find it difficult to think. And NEP tries to be actually very enabling in this particular aspect. So what degree you have earned is immaterial. What you actually have learned is more material.
Thank you.
Sir, as far as the research grants are considered, earlier the research grants for science and humanities were different. Now, what are the challenges that you expect in funding a multidisciplinary research?
Yes, so multidisciplinary research actually was still in the early parts of that in terms of funding in the country. we actually have not created yet mechanisms of bringing people from disparate disciplines together. What would be very worthwhile in doing in the coming years is say people working in social sciences and people working in natural sciences together and working on common problems. And it's challenging, but not impossible. And once we start creating examples of those more and more, automatically the funding mechanisms and everything will fall in place for doing that thing.
Yes. So one last question. Yes, Srivalsa sir, you want to ask something?
Yeah, please go ahead, ma'am.
No, you can. I'm asking you.
Yeah. One last question from my side.
Huh.
Sir, after C.V. Raman, the Nobel Prize in Science did not come to India, and that also was in British India. So after independence, Nobel Prize in Science did not come to India. So is it because there is any bias in Nobel Prize selection, or that our Indian scientists are not doing well in science, or are you of the opinion that we should move ahead regardless of these kinds of prizes come or not? We should move ahead. What is your say,
That's
sir?
a bit complicated question. It's a combination of everything together, what you have said. See, a lot of work that happens in India, if it is not communicated well in the community, much of the time it also goes unnoticed. There are good examples and examples of, let us say, for example, Jesse Bose inventing his communication instrument, and people actually attributed that to Marconi at some point of time. But now we have come to recognize that Jesse Bose was actually had done that a year or two earlier ahead of that thing. But around the world, it is known to be a Marconi's discovery. That's not a bias or something. It's simply because the world did not know that Bose had done it independently here. But there are many such things that actually happen around the world. And being geographically away from countries where a lot of actually these kind of things are happening at this moment, like Western Europe or US, it may happen that some of the discoveries that are made in India go unnoticed. There are very good examples of those. There's a person called G.N. Ramchandran. He did some fantastic work in University of Madras in the 1960s. And although he was recognized by his peers, close peers, but the work yet did not win recognition. And many people around the world believe that G.N. Ramchandran was a very deserving Nobel laureate, right? And many people who have gotten Nobel Prize after G.N. Ramchandran, but Ramchandran's work stands much taller than many of those people. Similarly, there's a person called Shambhunath Dey. He actually initiated some very, very important area in infectious diseases while he was in Calcutta. But his work also went unnoticed. Many people did not realize that Shambhunath Dey had some fantastic work. You have heard the story of test tube baby, right? And Dr. Mukherjee in Calcutta actually was because we have not done sufficient groups of work, or whether it has just not been communicated sufficiently. And it's a combination of all of it together. Especially in Nobel Prize, when a group of people, not only Nobel Prize, any recognition in India, let us say Shanti Swarup Bhatnagar, a group of people sit together and they're actually trying to be judgmental on pieces of somebody's work. There are a large number of deserving people who should get that recognition. Even Nobel Prize, there's a much larger number of people who should get that particular recognition. But it often happens that many aren't in the committee. Their biases actually can come in there, that they may prefer someone over the other or something like that. But that doesn't mean that the others who missed out have not done fundamental work. They have done equally fundamental work. And I've given you two examples, G.N. Ramchandran as well as Shambhunath Dey. Both of them were very deserving Nobel laureates from India, and they ought to have won Nobel Prize. But probably they did not get it for multiplicity of this particular reason. That's one. Number two, the last point that you said, that we should move on and work, that is of course true. Irrespective of recognition that you get from one or two or multiple of these awards and whatever fellowships and all, we must brush that aside. We must continue contributing to the world of knowledge. We don't work for the awards or the recognition. All that we work for is advancing the knowledge, And some of my friends have actually told me in person, in confidential, when we are talking personally in casual discussions, saying that if I had not won Nobel Prize, probably I would have been a better scientist. This is a statement actually some of my friends have told me in person. that I would have probably contributed to science much better if I had a Nobel laureate, because after getting Nobel Prize, that person started getting way more attention from public, and then had to spend time on other things that otherwise this person would have spent on doing actual work in the laboratory. So recognition, irrespective of those, whether it comes or not, one must continue working for advancing the knowledge, and that's what most people around the world would believe. And recognition is only just one part of it. One gets recognized, one doesn't get recognized, it doesn't matter. Of all the people, the most notable omission of Nobel Peace Prize ever, I don't have to tell you. People who use these principles around the world, people who fought wars of independence around the world, but this person himself missed the Nobel Peace Prize. Now, isn't that an irony? And is the world sad that this person did not get Nobel Peace Prize? This person was actually way above Nobel Peace Prize. In fact, he would have brought that recognition to Nobel Peace Prize if this person would have been given that Nobel Peace Prize. And I don't think we should be ashamed about it saying at all that Nobel Peace Prize would have added to his own glory by recognizing Gandhi as the apostle of peace, because for centuries together, such personalities are hardly born, and people who have followed Gandhi around the world have gone on in winning the Nobel Prize. So for them, it was a recognition. It would have been recognition for Nobel Peace Prize had Gandhi got the Nobel Peace Prize.
Yes, sir. Very right. It is a very enlightening piece of advice to the young scientists, inspiring advice. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you very much, sir. You talked about on all the aspects of research. You touched every aspect, and right from the education system, how we are going to inculcate all the scientific aptitude in children. You talked about and when there will be such concentration of research in universities, because as the NEP comes into force, there will be a lot of concentration on research, and definitely we will get some Nobel Prize also. So so you have really enlightened us on so many issues, and and that too in a very lucid manner. Thank you very much, sir. And over to Anish, sir.
Thank you so much, sir, for such an insightful interview. And I also like to thank Manjushree Sardesh Pandey and Sri Valsa ji for moderating very well. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Give my regards to Raghunandan ji. Thank you.
Yeah. Sure, sir. So.